Western countries are pessimistic. According to an Ipsos survey, far more people believe that the younger generation will be worse off than their parents' generation. This is a majority position in countries such as the US, Britain, France, Spain. In Canada, 46% believe the younger generation will be worse off, compared to only 23% who say they will be better off. There's plenty of talk of living in a
polycrisis.
We're in a polycrisis.
And a culture shift has also happened. Books are increasingly written with a language of caution as opposed to a language of progress. But I want to explore these themes and see how they compare to reality. We'll look at economics, governance, international trends, climate change, and finally some of the psychological factors involved. One of the largest sentiments of this pessimism in that younger generations are worse off is economic. The sentiment is that wages have long stagnated, homeownership is out of reach, and poverty is increasing. So let's dig into these and find out how much truth there is here. Compare millennials to previous generations, as that's what there's data for, and millennials are often the prevalent view of this label of being worse off than previous generations. This, however, seems to be a bit of a myth. So if we first look at median household income for people in the age brackets of 25 to 34 years old across generations, which is adjusted for number of individuals in the household and adjusted for inflation, we see that Gen X and Boomers were roughly earning the same. However, when we add in millennials, it's clear millennials are actually substantially ahead. In 2016 adjusted dollars, millennials after tax median income was measured at $44,100, compared to Boomers and Gen Xers $33,300. Similar studies in the US have shown the same thing. When we look at net assets, which are assets minus debt, millennials also come out ahead despite higher levels of debt. When looking at millennials in their early to mid-30s, the data from 2016 showed that millennials were purchasing homes at rates around 51%, similar to Gen X at 51%, and only slightly below the baby boomers at 55%. Now, more recent data has suggested that homeownership rates are declining in the last couple of years. We have entered a bubble in terms of affordability. It will be hard to predict how this will affect homeownership going forward, but it is worth pointing out that there were similar bubbles in the early 90s, 80s, as well as others. To take a quick look at trends in poverty in Canada, there is an uptick in poverty from 2020 until now. However, to add some context, we see that poverty rates have actually fallen since 2012. The Gini coefficient, which is an index measuring inequality in a country, has fluctuated for Canada between around 31 and 35 over the last several decades, which means Canada is a fairly equal country, and that hasn't changed much over the last few decades. So, all in all, things are going fairly well for the current generation economically. Is there reason to believe that is changing? Well, I made an entire video looking at some problems in the Canadian economy that you can take a look at for some more detail. And there is some real uncertainty there. Canada is a vibrant democracy though, and the power of democracy is its ability to self-correct over time. And while a stagnant economy is something to be pessimistic about, it's worth putting that in perspective that even if Canada's economy stagnates for a longer period of time, Canadians will still enjoy one of the highest qualities of life on the planet. For comparison, Japan has been in a near constant state of stagnation for decades now, and the quality of life there remains high. This doesn't mean we should be complacent about our economy, just that we should put it in perspective and have a bit of context for it. As anger is boiling over in Western Canada, protesters begin the trek towards Ottawa to give the government a piece of their mind. Weeks pass, and as thousands of protesters assemble, the federal government, wanting to disperse them, sends in the police to clear them away. The Prime Minister described the protesters as not a mere uprising against law and order, but a definite revolutionary effort on the part of a group of men to usurp authority and destroy government. I am of course describing the story of the On to Ottawa trek from 1935, when anger over the Great Depression reached a tipping point, and a stream of unemployed men began making their way to Ottawa. Many of them had gathered in Regina along the way when the Prime Minister at the time, Richard Bedford Bennett, sent in the RCMP, precipitating a riot that resulted in 2 deaths, dozens of injuries, and over 100 arrests. I'm telling this story because too often the pessimism around government comes from a place of not really knowing history. It views today as somehow particularly bad, when we can no longer trust government, trust the media, or what have you. And the problem with this is that many governments in the past, for various reasons, have done things that were typically much worse. The difference is today that there's far more scrutiny on everything that happens, and that scrutiny is really never ending. To add some context, Canada today enjoys a laudable record, recognized as one of the freest countries in the world, receiving a near perfect score of 98 out of 100 in the Global Freedom Ranking in 2023 from Freedom House, making us the fifth most free country in the world. The Economist 2022 Democracy Index puts Canada 12th, which is a decline from years prior to 2021. The OECD Better Life Index in 2020 puts Canada 4th, and US News and World Report's Best Countries Index puts Canada as the second most livable country in the world after just Switzerland. And many of these rankings of freedom and well-being generally put Canada near the top. Today it has become popular to claim that free speech is on the decline and everyone is offended. But again, with historical context, this is less clear, although there are many examples throughout history in Canada of free speech being curtailed for certain groups or during periods like the Two World Wars. Possibly the most egregious attempt to limit free speech came from the Alberta provincial government in 1937, which passed a bill to ensure the publication of accurate news and information. This would have allowed the province to determine what news was true or not. This was, however, found to be beyond the powers of the Albertan government by the Supreme Court of Canada in 1939. But to make my overall point, I want to focus on the evolution of content in Canada. When cinema first arrived to Canada in the early 20th century, almost every province got to work creating their own censor board or set of regulations to modify what was shown. In Quebec, the main job of the censorship board was to prevent anything counter to the Catholic Church. In all the provinces west of Quebec, censorship took the form of both perceived morality as well as a healthy dose of anti-Americanism, meaning anything depicting sexuality, drinking and drug use, guns, or displays of American patriotism tended to be outright banned or at least heavily edited. Although these laws were relaxed over time and certain provinces had more liberal laws at different periods, provinces still carried out various forms of censorship into the 60s and even the 70s, with the government of Alberta banning Andy Warhol's Frankenstein in 1974. So much for the history of freedom of speech that apparently ended yesterday. Today, very little is censored, with most of what still is normally deemed abusive, such as child pornography. Today we are flooded with content from all different parts of the world and viewpoints from across the political spectrum. What has changed today is less that people are offended easily and more that we are inundated with things that have the potential to offend us on a nearly minute-by-minute basis. Canada, like any country, is imperfect and has governments that do things that broad swaths of the population don't like. Canada is lucky in that it has a fairly decentralized government, such that most decision-making around everything from healthcare, to education, to energy policy, to policing, to most infrastructure, is the jurisdiction of provinces and municipalities, allowing for most decision-making to happen at the local rather than the federal level. And although not everything is perfect all the time, it is worth remembering that Canada has far more mechanisms for self-correction than many other countries in the world. As war rages in Eastern Europe, conflict in the Middle East threatens to expand, democracies around the world slide into autocracy, and talk of the end of globalization proliferates, surely we will find reason to be pessimistic when talking about the wider world, right? Here too, we find a more mixed story. To start with war, we are experiencing an increase in conflicts around the world and a rise in the suffering associated. But to put this in context, deaths to state-based conflicts was on a relative declining trend that has been interrupted by recent conflicts in Africa and Europe. However, even these conflicts so far have not been nearly as deadly as the conflicts throughout the 50s, 70s, 80s, let alone to speak of the first half of the 20th century. And the relationships between countries have generally gotten more peaceful. This doesn't mean even that most of the world is in a kind of warm peace with their neighboring countries, but a much higher percentage of the world today is than 50 years ago. And as for global poverty, using the measure of extreme poverty, which is defined as living below the international poverty line of $2.15 USD a day, adjusted for inflation and cost differences between countries, there has been a steady decline over the last few decades. In 1990, the share of the global population living below this threshold was 37.8%. Flash forward to 2019, that number is 8.4%. Now, while the COVID-19 pandemic did push a number of people back into poverty, we're still talking about less than 10% living in extreme poverty compared to almost 40% just a few decades ago. And while, yes, extreme poverty is an extreme measurement, and living in just poverty is still bad, this is nonetheless a monumental achievement. And the often quipped end of globalism, with the rise of nationalism and a new Cold War, is Probably exaggerated. According to a massive global survey by Ipsos, roughly 66% of respondents globally think that globalism is good for their country, and 62% think that globalism is good for them personally. 74% of respondents said they would like to live in a different part of the world. 71% said people across the world had more in common than differences, and more people said they felt they were a citizen of the world than said they were a citizen of their own country. And the same was true of global brands versus local brands. Now, it's worth pointing out that the countries the most pessimistic about globalism in general tend to be European and North American countries, with Greece, Belgium, and France being the only countries that had more negative view of globalization than positive. And Canada and the US are also closer to this end of the spectrum, they'll still view globalism more positively than negatively. The same is true when it comes to viewing oneself as a citizen of the world versus a citizen of the particular country. Japanese are the least likely to view themselves as citizens of the world, and Canada is not far behind. But regardless, it seems that globalism is likely a harder force to kill than its critics have suggested. Finally, the world is becoming a more equal place, as the inequality between countries has fallen over the last several decades. To use the Gini coefficient again, a popular metric of inequality, in 1990, the between-country measurement was more than 60, indicating a high disparity between countries, and today that's fallen to around 47.1, which, although it still implies a high level of inequality, it's considerably less. Now, a caveat to this is that inequality within countries over this period has increased. Though as a global trend, this increase has been relatively small, about 3 or 4 points, and global inequality as a whole has broadly fallen since 1990. Though it has seen an uptick during the COVID-19 pandemic. So while the world is far from perfect, there are many positive trends to look at that don't fit the doom and gloom narrative. Climate-related disasters have increased fivefold in the last 50 years. In the US, 8 out of the 10 years with the highest number of natural disasters occurred in the last decade. Global trade is being disrupted by droughts in regions such as Central America, lowering the flow of traffic through the Panama Canal. Global warming and the changing climate it causes is the ever-present issue, and one that surely warrants a degree of the pessimism it elicits. Some of that pessimism for events already happening, some for what seems clear to happen, and some for the uncertainty, such as the slowing of the Gulf Stream that isn't fully understood. And while the biggest problem here is that uncertainty that makes us unsure of some of the negatives, there's room for optimism here as well. The first part of the good news is that the world nearly universally recognizes this as a problem, which is very different than even a decade ago. While we can argue whether or not many countries are doing as much as they should or could, most countries are doing something. And despite the increase in disasters, preparedness has meant that fewer people die from natural disasters than throughout the earlier part of the 20th century, even though the cost from disasters has increased. For the second point, most research is now showing that global warming will more or less stop almost immediately once countries reach net zero, and within the next quarter of a century after, roughly half of all carbon dioxide and methane released by humans will be out of the atmosphere. Now, I can already hear the keyboards typing away. That requires us to actually hit net zero, and in a reasonable time frame. So the biggest things here are that first, nearly all countries have signed on to the Paris Climate Accord, which agrees to net zero by 2050. Whether that's soon enough is debatable, but the point is, it's acknowledged. So the other point is, emissions have been decoupling from economic growth over the past 3 decades. While this is very evident in countries like the UK, the US, and Canada, it's true in China as well, and it's beginning in India. But overall, the global economy has decoupled from emissions. And this is likely to continue as the cost for renewables has continued to fall, making them cost competitive with even the cheapest forms of fossil fuels. And when you consider that big polluters such as China and India will be interested not just in getting the cheapest form of energy, but also improving the deeply polluted air quality in their cities, clean tech is likely to have an edge. And to top this off, nearly 20% of all cars sold globally in 2023 were electric, a trend that looks like it will continue to increase as China's BYD continues to ramp up production. So to end this video, I'm in no way trying to say that the world is perfect and that there's not real problems the world faces, or real problems that Western countries or specifically Canada faces. But there are also many reasons to be positive about living in the current moment in history. Relative wealth, access to vaccines and medicine, the decline in violence means that 2023 was likely among the best years in history in the world for human flourishing. The distant past and even the recent past are generally worse than the present, and there are even reasons to be optimistic. But this begs the question, if things aren't so bad, then why are we so pessimistic? Some of this is a natural human reflex. We have a natural negativity bias. It's far more likely that an inconvenience or a negative experience ruins your day rather than something positive makes your day. You remember that negative interaction you had at the grocery store all day, but the cashier who was nice to you is forgotten quickly. Another part of this is gradual versus sudden change. Positive things tend to accumulate over time. You accrue wealth, you receive raises, your investments accumulate slowly, but an unexpected cost that sets you back happens suddenly, meaning we remember the specific time that the negative thing happened, but there's no specific time the positive thing happened since it was gradual. Nostalgia for a time gone by has more to do with narrative than reality. We're nostalgic for a time in the past, not because things were actually better, but because we miss being younger with fewer responsibilities, or because we watch shows or movies that only show the positives of this era with none of the negatives. And some of this is more modern. We're now presented on a nearly second-to-second basis with constant information about the world. The media naturally skews negative for exactly the reasons stated before. Positive things, more generally, happen gradually. Negative things happen all at once. A war breaking out or an earthquake occurring are newsworthy. All the countries that didn't have war breaking out in them are not. A plane crash is newsworthy, whereas a plane taking off and landing successfully, again, is not. The perfect example of this, in Ontario at least, is that you've probably all heard about Ottawa's problem with its tram service, the LRT. There was news on this almost daily for over a year. The delays, the problems it ran into, the constant breakdowns. What you're probably less familiar with is the refurbishment of the Darlington nuclear reactor, a project started in 2016 that is expected to finish in 2028, though the refurbishment of the first and second reactors have already been completed. The station provides roughly 20% of all power in Ontario, and if you haven't heard about it, the reason is that there's not much to report on. Like I said, the first and second reactors have already been finished more or less on time and on budget. In other words, a successful project isn't newsworthy, but one that goes wrong is, and this skews us towards a view that nothing can get done right anymore. The negativity bias in the media is bad enough, but throw this into the modern internet of YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, etc., where outrage and pessimism get clicks and shares. Negativity spreads like wildfire, partially driven by our own behavior and partially driven by algorithms that want to keep you on the platform longer. And this can make it seem like things are far worse than they really are. I don't want to diminish the real suffering that still exists in the world, and this video could go on forever pointing at good and bad things. But overall, there are a lot of positive trends in the world that don't get nearly enough attention. And as for some of the problems, particularly in Canada, I have some videos right here that go a lot more into detail. So thanks for watching, and I hope you watch these other videos as well.